Today we're going to be talking about Darwin and how evolution works. And the first thing we need to address is the theory of evolution and what the word theory actually means. The theory of evolution is not an educated guess. Anybody who says the theory of evolution is just a theory, or you might hear someone say, if the theory of evolution was true, it'd be a law. These people have no idea what the word theory even means. A theory is not a guess. That'd be a hypothesis. Theories are explanations for laws or things that we can observe. For example, the law of gravity. If we throw something out the window, we can observe that it will fall. It's going to fall to the ground. We know that. We can see it happen. The theory of gravity, on the other hand, explains that gravity pulls things towards the center of the earth, which is why it fell. And yes, there is the law of gravity. And yes, there is the theory of gravity. Laws are things that we can observe. Theories are explanations for why or how laws work. So when people say theory of evolution is just a theory, they have no idea what the word theory even means. And with that being said, we can get started. The first one is patterns of biodiversity that Darwin noted. In a single trip to the Brazilian rainforest, Darwin found 68 species of beetles. He documented the characteristics and habitats of the different species that he saw all around his trip, all around the world. He started documenting the characteristics and habitats where those species were. He didn't want to just describe it, though. He wanted to explain it. As he traveled with an open mind and open eyes, he saw three distinctive patterns of biological diversity. The first one is species vary globally. They're different all around the world. They vary locally, even in our own backyard, and they change over time. Species vary globally. Let's talk about the first one. Darwin visited a wide range of habitats in South America, Australia, and Africa. Pretty much covered the entire southern hemisphere. He found flightless ground-dwelling birds called rheas. They look a lot like ostriches, which he found in South America. Now, rheas can only be found in South America, while ostriches can only be found in Africa. And we're talking about in the wild, not at the local zoo. When visiting Australia, he found a flightless bird called an emu. Darwin noticed that different, yet ecologically similar animal species inhabited separated, but ecologically similar habitats all around the world. Darwin noted also that the rabbits in the European grasslands were missing from the grasslands of South America and Australia. In addition, kangaroos could only be found in Australia and nowhere else in the world. Why? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Why things like this he observed. Darwin began reflecting on his way home, started looking over the patterns that he saw, started looking over all his notes, all the observations he made, trying to begin to explain it. Well, when he got home, he sent off the plant and animal species to experts for identification because he knew nothing about identifying any animal or plant species. So he sent it off to experts, and the scientific community was buzzing. They went crazy. Found all kinds of species that no one knew about before. For example, the Galapagos mockingbirds, there were 3 separate species found nowhere else in the world. The wrens, the warblers, and the blackbirds that he said weren't, unusual, weren't important. They were all actually species of finches, which are small birds. The same was true with the Galapagos tortoises, the marine iguanas, and many plants that Darwin collected. Darwin spent many years researching ideas about species and evolution, even though he didn't know what evolution was at the time. The evidence suggested, and we have to look at evidence. If you don't have evidence for something, there's nothing to back up what you are saying. The evidence that he found suggested that the species in the world, they're not fixed, and they can change by some natural process. And he saw that in the fossils with the glyptodont and the armadillo, how they used to be larger, but now they're smaller, how they change over time. Let's talk about population growth, and we'll talk about how it ties into evolution in just a few minutes. Thomas Malthus, who's an economist, noted that humans were being born faster than they were dying, which caused overcrowding. Malthus reasoned that if the human population grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone. And the human population has grown unchecked. There's nobody telling you how many kids you have to have or how many kids you can't have, unless you live in China, and that's a different story. Well, forces that work against population growth are some common sense things like war, people die in war, famine, which is starvation, and disease, which can kill people. Darwin realized that Malthus's reasoning applied even more to other organisms than it did to humans. For example, maple trees can produce thousands of seeds, and oysters can lay millions of eggs in a single year. Well, if that's true, and maple trees have been around for a very long time, several years, why aren't there hundreds of thousands or even not millions of maple trees all around us? Of course, there's millions of maple trees in the world, but there's not millions of maple trees all around us. Why isn't the ocean overflowing with oysters? Well, that's because most offspring die before they mature. They don't overrun the world because the offspring don't make it. Darwin realized most organisms don't survive and reproduce, while some did survive. And if they survived, they obviously reproduced. He wanted to know why. He wanted the explanation. Sure, he saw it, but he wanted to know why. Now, let's talk about artificial selection. Everybody recognizes these. These are dogs. They all come from a wolf. So artificial selection is how dogs got here. They did not come from natural selection. So to find an explanation for change in nature, Darwin had to start somewhere. So he studied change produced by plant and animal breeders. Plant and animal breeders will pick out the best plants or the best animals to continue on their business. For example, breeders know that organisms vary. Some plants bear larger or smaller fruit than the average for their species, and some cows give more or less milk than others in their herd. If you have a plant not getting much fruit, you're probably not going to reproduce with it. You get rid of it. That's artificial selection. If you have a cow not giving you much milk, you're probably not going to reproduce with it. That is artificial selection. Darwin found out from breeders that some of the variation could be passed from parents to offspring and used to improve crops and livestock. In artificial selection, nature provides the variations and humans select those they find useful. And because humans are doing the selection here, that's why it's called artificial selections, because humans are controlling it. Now, Darwin had no idea how heredity worked, but he knew variation occurred in wild species, and these variations were the raw material for evolution. It was after this that he found the scientific explanation for evolution. After many years, he finally found the explanation. He finally found the why, everything that he had been searching for. Now, here's another example of artificial selection. If you're still unsure about what it is, you have a Labrador, you have a Poodle. You cross them, you're going to get a Labradoodle. That is a pretty easy example of artificial selection, something that we can all understand. Evolution by natural selection. Something that a lot of people have probably heard and probably don't understand, which is why they misuse the word theory. Darwin worked out the main points of his theory on natural selection, but he didn't publish his work for 20 years. Imagine working on something for years, putting it on the side for 20 years, and not doing anything with it. Well, people had ridiculed Lamarck's ideas, and Darwin, he didn't want to be wrong. Nobody wants to be wrong. We all hate the idea of being wrong, and Darwin was no exception. He didn't want to be wrong. He didn't want to be ridiculed. He wanted to gather as much evidence as possible before going public so people can say, hey, you're wrong. You're a joke. Here's the name you'll probably only hear once and you'll never hear again. The only reason Darwin is famous today is because in 1858, he reviewed an essay by Alfred Russel Wallace, and he found out that Alfred's ideas about evolution were very similar to his. He said, here's a guy who says the same thing I do. It's either going to be Alfred or Charles going forward to come up with the idea of evolution. So Darwin worked at a frantic pace. He didn't want to miss out, and he moved forward with his own work, and in 1859, just less than a year later, published his first complete work with a book that everybody has probably heard of, The Origin of Species. Darwin's great contribution, and it is great, was to describe a process in nature that could operate like artificial selection. Darwin combined his own thoughts with ideas from Malthus and Lamarck and modified them. The struggle for existence. After reading Malthus, Darwin realized that if more individuals are produced than can survive, members of a population must compete to obtain food, living space, and other necessities of life. Now remember, Malthus talked about humans. Darwin is talking about all organisms. Darwin described this as the struggle for existence. How did organisms come out on top in the struggle? Variation and adaptation. Darwin knew individuals have natural variations, and those variations play a vital role, and those variations that play a vital role were from traits. Because these organisms reproduce sexually, you're going to get a shuffling of genes and a shuffling of traits. It's all random what's passed on. The mother doesn't get to choose what's passed on to the offspring. The dad doesn't get to choose what's passed on to that offspring. So these variations they're talking about are the combination of genes from both the mother and the father of any organism, including us. He hypothesized that some variants are suited to life in their environment than others. For example, members of a predatory species, the animals that do the hunting, the ones that are faster or have longer claws or sharper teeth, they're going to be able to catch more prey. The members of a prey species, the ones that are being hunted, the ones that are faster or better camouflage, can avoid being caught. That's why they can survive more so than the others. Any inheritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, not just survive, but survive and reproduce in its environment is called an adaptation. Adaptations can include new body parts or structures, behavior, or physiological responses. Now, when we're talking about behavior, we're talking about innate behaviors. For example, I play the drums. Just because I play the drums and I know how, doesn't mean that if I have a kid, my kid's going to know how to play the drums. That's not in my DNA. Anything in my DNA is going to get passed on. But I don't get to choose. It's all random, and that causes variations. Let's talk about survival of the fittest, a term everybody has heard. According to Darwin, difference in adaptations, which we just talked about, affects an individual's fitness. Now, when we talk about fitness, we're describing how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. When we talk about survival of the fittest, it's not just surviving. It's surviving and reproducing. A lot of people forget the and reproducing part. Organisms that can survive and reproduce in their environment are said to have high fitness, and the opposite is true for low fitness. If an organism can't survive, it obviously can't reproduce, and it has what we call a low fitness. The difference in rates of survival and reproduction is called survival of the fittest. Survival means more than staying alive. And I know I've said this, but I'm making a point to say it again. It includes reproducing and passing on adaptations to the next generation, which is the reproducing part. Natural selection. Darwin named the mechanism for evolution natural selection because of its similarities to artificial selection. Natural selection is a process. It is the process by which organisms with variations most suited to their local environment survive and can leave more offspring. And because they have survived, they're going to be able to produce more offspring, passing on those traits. For example, polar bears, they used to be brown. Well, obviously, the polar bears that were brown, when they're against the snow, they're going to stick out. It's a lot harder for them to sneak up on their prey. Somewhere along the line, there was a mutation that caused the polar bears to become white. Well, when you have a white polar bear and a brown polar bear, the white polar bear is going to be able to blend into the snow. It's going to be harder to detect. It's much more successful at sneaking up on its prey. And that's why you only see white polar bears today and no brown or very limited population of brown polar bears. Natural selection occurs in any situation in which more individuals are born than can survive. There's a natural heritable variation, and there's a variable fitness among the individuals. That is how natural selection works. It has to meet these three conditions. Natural selection doesn't make organisms better. Everybody who doesn't know about evolution, who constantly argue against evolution, say, well, why aren't things getting better? Evolution doesn't necessarily make things better. Adaptations, they don't have to be perfect. Just good enough to pass on the genes to the next generation. There are birds on the Galapagos Islands that have lost the ability to fly. That's not necessarily a better adaptation, but because the birds can survive, they're able to pass on the genes to the next generation. At one point, they were able to fly. Somewhere along the line, there was a mutation where they lost the ability to fly. But because they can survive and pass on those genes, they are still there on the Galapagos Islands today. So when people ask, well, why haven't we gotten better? Why are animals more perfect? Because evolution, natural selection doesn't mean becoming perfect. It doesn't mean better. It does not move in a predefined line. It works by natural selection, which we've been talking about. Adaptations can change as the environment changes. If the environment changes faster than organisms can adapt, then they may become extinct, just like the dinosaurs. Huge asteroid hit the Earth. The environment changed very rapidly. The ones that weren't killed in the initial explosion froze to death because all the debris blocked out the sun. There's no radiation, no thermal heat coming down. They froze to death. The ones that didn't freeze to death starved to death because we all rely on plants. Plants are the ultimate energy source. If there's no sun, there's no photosynthesis. If there's no photosynthesis, there's no plants. If there's no plants, there's no herbivores. If there's no herbivores, there's no carnivores. Common descent. So we're going to wrap up with this. Every organism alive today, doesn't matter what you want, doesn't matter what you don't want, facts are facts. Evidence is evidence. And every organism alive today is descended from parents who survived and reproduced. Every living organism, they all have Hox genes, which is found in every single organism. You will also find the DNA code A, C, G, and T, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Every single organism has those four ingredients from DNA. Darwin proposed that successful species over time, making adaptations, could evolve into a new species. And we'll talk about this again in the next video next week. Deep time gave enough time for natural selection to occur. You can look back into time by looking at fossils, and you can find how organisms are related and how we all share a common ancestor. According to the principle of common descent, all species, both living and extinct, are descended from ancient common ancestors. The evidence is all around us. A single tree of life today links all living things together. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Please feel free to leave a comment. And I'm very, very passionate about evolution. I take it very, very seriously because so many people misunderstand it. Please share this video with someone. If you don't want to share the video, that's fine too. Go out and educate somebody. Let them know what the theory of evolution actually is. We'll see you guys next week.